our moderator tonight, Andrew Kirby, who's one of our councillors, one of our young councillors from the USI of the ACT. Andrew is experienced in planning, policy, strategy and leadership, and he has a diverse background both in and out of the military. He's held a number of leadership roles as well as being selected for a number of high-profile staff and representational appointments. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, John. Well, gentlemen, ladies, good evening. As John just said, my name is Andrew Kirby from the Council of the United Service Institute. So welcome to the first of three sessions we're running in preparation for the Defence White Paper. Joining me tonight, I think, is a very distinguished panel, faces who I'm sure you're all familiar with. So starting from my left is Gary Humphries, former Federal Senator and ACT Chief Minister. Gary served in the ACT and Commonwealth Parliaments for almost 25 years. First elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1989 at the inauguration of self-government for the Territory. Gary is a former shadow front bencher in the Defence portfolio. Also Peter Leahy, the Foundation Director of the National Security Institute at the University of Canberra. Peter retired from the Army in July 2008 after a 37-year career as a soldier, concluding his career in the Army with 6 years as Chief of the Army, making him the longest-serving incumbent in the position since General Strevell in the 1920s. In 2007, Peter was elevated to the Companion of the Order of Australia. From my right, we have John O'Callaghan. John's the Executive Officer of the Australian Industry Group Defence Council and has held a number of positions over the last 15 years, including Assistant Secretary of the Capital Equipment Coordination Department of Defence. And to my right, recently joining us is Chris Hillman, a face familiar, I'm sure, to most of you as a political editor for ABC's 7:30. Chris previously co-hosted 666 ABC Canberra's top-rating breakfast program, produced mornings on 774 ABC Melbourne, and worked as the Chief Political Correspondent for ABC Radio Current Affairs. Just a few remarks before we begin. Tonight we're presenting a hypothetical scenario. We're in a panel of distinguished experts, that's you four gentlemen. We'll debate and formulate policy advice to government in the face of a series of cumulative scenarios. So we'll work through 5 different little pocket scenarios that move forward in time and hopefully aggregate towards a picture or a few conclusions at the end. The scenarios, I must stress, are hyperbolic. So they're, if not worst case, they are worse case. And they're intended to provide a framework to explore different policy settings that government may wish to consider in the next white paper. I do stress they do not represent my views, the USI's views, or indeed any of our panellists' views. You've set a wonderful scene as we transition 3 years into the future yet again to 2021. With a decline in the manufacturing industry and the end of the mining boom, we see thousands of families suffering from structural unemployment. A number of prominent figures have reprised the policy question of where to build the new future frigate. Many people are calling for it to be built onshore in Australia to stimulate the job market and create new industry opportunities. Numerous stakeholders argue that this would be a means to reskill and re-employ thousands of workers, and an overseas option would export hundreds of billions of dollars to another millions of dollars to another country's industry and jobs. Now, the main rival bid for this project is a United States-based contractor who proposes a construction cost of only 60% of the onshore built option. This model is already in service with the US Navy and other fleets and proposes many economies of scale, including interoperability and integration with one of our largest partners. John O'Callaghan, we hear a lot about the valley of death in naval shipbuilding. What argument are you making to the Minister of Defence in 2021 about building this slightly more expensive and unproven design in Australia?
Well, I think, Andrew, in the context of the 1.9% of GDP currently being spent on defence, the valley of death's problem, in fact, has been resolved. In fact, just to hark back to an announcement yesterday, I think the government has been on the right track in regard to dealing with that issue as part of the review that's been presented to ministers recently. Not all the announcements about that have been made, but I'm reasonably confident that valley of death is now being properly addressed. So I don't think that'll be a problem in 2018 nor 2021. I should say also that there will always be demand by defence industry to do things in Australia, particularly because it's industry that actually has to sustain the platforms that are operated by the Defence Force, or the Navy, Army or Air Force in the main. So the more we do in Australia to support those platforms, the better. It doesn't make sense, for example, to have to go back to the United States to change wheels on large aircraft. That does not make sense to me at all, or at least tyres on large aircraft. So from a defence industry perspective, I believe that there is a strong argument to put, and continually put to government, that we need to do more here, not less, including building on the success, for example, of the previous Anzac frigate project, the most successful naval shipbuilding project in Australia since the Second World War, bar none. I should also say that the environment in 2021 will look a lot better from the point of view of advanced technology manufacturing companies in Australia now being full partners in global supply chains. Companies like Quickstep, for example, and Chemrick and Morand and Ferrer, among many others. So the demise of the manufacturing sector in the vehicle and vehicle supply chain industry that we're seeing now, to some extent will be changed through the process of focusing more on advanced technology companies doing great things in the global supply chain. By 2021, that supply chain will be much larger and much stronger and much more profitable from the point of view of Australian shareholders.
Peter Lane, we alluded to one of your legacies as a service chief before, which was the procurement of tank, the M1A1 tank for Australia. An off-the-shelf purchase, rapidly acquired, not necessarily adhering to many of the long bureaucratic processes in defence procurement. What is your advice to government?
I think I'd say to government that you've been listening to that industry lot too much. And that where did you get the thought that these things were going to be slightly more expensive? I think they'll be grossly more expensive. And as the scenario points out, they could be of less capability. And that worries me. I think we should be looking for the best capability, and it goes back to the issue that I was talking about in terms of risk. Let's imagine that the minister's children are very well judged people, and they've joined the army, one in the Navy and one in the Air Force. And I would ask the minister, well, are you going to buy the second best for your son to drive or fly or sail around in? And I think that's the point. If we're going to ask our soldiers, sailors and airmen to go to war, we should be giving them the best equipment so that we can minimise the cost. And of course there are other issues involved here. The purchase of off-the-shelf equipment means it happens quickly, it's in service, the technology costs are amortised, the development costs are amortised, and it certainly aids interoperability. And I do see that well into the future we're working with the United States, so off-the-shelf stuff does bring a lot of advantages. If we are to produce capability here in Australia, I think there are 2 points. One is that the costs have to be absolutely transparent, so that government has to say, well, we can buy for $1 billion these ships from America. For $1.5 billion, we can buy these ships here in Australia. And that $0.5 billion is about employment in Australia. It's not about defence capability, it's purely about employment in Australia. So I think we have to be very transparent and nominate what those costs are. And the second point is, for whatever we do, we've got to make sure that it's long-term sustainment and maintenance. That's what can be done in Australia, and I think, frankly, that's what is going to happen to a lot of our industry here in Australia. It's got to be about the maintenance and sustainment and support perhaps into Asia for the maintenance and sustainment of similar equipment that would go into Asia.
Gary Humphries, yet another phone call from the minister, come up for a coffee, yet another entry in the lobbyist register. Mate, he says, I've got the military telling me the best kit is made overseas, in this case this particular ship. It's the best and it's cheaper. But I've got industry in my ear telling me we've got it sorted this time, the risk is reduced, we know the costs. Yes, it's a little bit more expensive, but by geez, it's good for the economy and good for jobs. What are you advising?
Well, I'm assuming that the pressures from 2018 to contain the defence budget are still there. There hasn't been a general relaxation of the pressures in that space, so we're still looking to keep cost of defence down. In these circumstances, I'd say to the Minister, mate, you've got to go with what advice you're getting from the military. There just isn't a case for spending more than you need to spend for the sake of getting potentially less capable equipment. It just doesn't add up. You obviously have a problem, a domestic problem with those parts of the country where these tanks or planes, whatever, would have been built, loss of jobs in those areas, loss of economic potential and so on, but you would say that at the end of the day, there are much better ways of stimulating jobs, creating jobs in those areas than spending, potentially billions more than we need on equipment to supply our basic defence needs.
Chris Hillman, a decision on this project is imminent. The cheaper overseas version, possibly more in quantity, or the Australian-made version. The Minister comes under your program. What are the questions you're asking? Are you more concerned about jobs or more concerned about value for money?
Well, I want you to abolish of your mind the idea that the media is anyway consistent when it asks questions. I'm allowed to break windows on both sides of your house, essentially. And the Minister's just come off an interview in Adelaide where he was with Matt and Dave. And essentially all that South Australia is interested in is because if unemployment's 10% in Australia, then it's 15% in South Australia. And the South Australians, all they want is the capacity to build ships. So it's all about industry policy. Now, when he comes onto my program, it's a national program, I would say to him, Minister, what is it you're trying to achieve? Is it a defence policy, or is it an industry policy, or is it a hybrid policy which basically doesn't fulfil either of your needs, which it would appear it is? And I've just had our favourite commentator, Peter Lay, on, and he says to me, this is an extra $500 million that you're going to be spending. So isn't that money better spent on health if you get a better outcome?